Child Protection Week has once again thrown the spotlight on the vulnerability of children. The world, specifically South Africa, is an ever more hostile place for children to grow up in, with a rise in reports of malnutrition here in South Africa amongst our children now added to the ongoing scourge of crime, murder, abuse and further neglect. Now, Professor Mark Tomlinson is the director of the Institute for Life Course Research based at Stellenbosch University, and he's written a powerful opinion piece that's published on the News 24 platform, pointing out the basic ways that we as a society are failing our most vulnerable, and he joins us now virtually from Cape Town. Mark, thanks for your time this evening, as always. Now, you started this piece by a very simple, but I thought very powerful and sobering comparison of the murder rate of children in South Africa compared to those in the UK and in Italy. Explain to me why you decided on those countries and how stark those numbers really are.
Thanks, Marcel. So, I mean, the reason I chose those countries was fairly arbitrary, really. What I did is I looked at a sort of table of populations of countries of the world, and I picked two of the countries that were closest to our population in South Africa. And Italy is almost identical, and the UK was higher. It wasn't slightly higher, so it wasn't about a rich country versus us or anything. It was just similar population sizes, because then the comparison means a little bit more. And, you know, and in some ways perhaps it is a bit unfair, but, you know, it is very stark when you think about in South Africa, almost 4 children, just under 4 children are murdered every day. So just in a 3-month period, you're looking at more, you know, you're looking at hundreds of children. And in fact, when you look at Italy, the murder rate, it's actually quite hard to find the murder rate of children in Italy because it's so rare. And in fact, the whole of Italy in 2021 or 2020 was 278 across all age groups. We have more child murders in 3 months than that entire year in Italy. So it makes it very stark by using those countries.
You went further to write about, I mean, you speak about issues pertaining to our children quite often, and you speak in this piece about how you're always struck that amongst all these staggering statistics that we often have the spotlight on during these awareness month, sadly, that there is always 1 or 2 stories that really gains the attention of the nation. And you point to one that really gained the attention of many of us here working in the news world as well, of 6-year-old Bontle Mashiane, who was brutally murdered in Mpumalanga just earlier in May. I read somewhere once that there's something to do with, and I'm asking you to put on your hat as a behavioral scientist, and I've spoken to you wearing that hat before, about there needing to be stories and names put to stories to gain the attention of a society that's really weighed down by these unending negative statistics around murder, around crime, about how difficult it is to survive. What more will it take, other than every few months or even weeks at times, these horrid stories of how our children are being neglected, to really get our attention, and yet it does nothing to change our behavior? What do you read into that in terms of our behavior and lack of reaction to it?
Well, I think it's important to say that I think people, you know, most people do react, you know, hugely to these terrible stories and feel incredibly sad, incredibly moved, horrified by them. And then there's that sense of to some extent, hopelessness, powerlessness. What can I do as an individual? And I think when I was writing this piece, I read a piece by Pierre de Vos in a blog he wrote about, you know, kind of he called it spectacular incidents of racism. And what he was warning against is that when you focus a lot on the spectacular incidents, and obviously we should, but what that can't be used as is an excuse to then not focus on all the little things we have to do on a daily basis. And I think to say to your viewers, we must, you know, every day note another horror murder of a child, I think it's probably in some ways too much for most people to bear. And so I suppose the piece is really trying to say, well, then what can we do as individuals? How can we respond? And I kind of thought, well, part of it is about I think what we're really getting wrong in South Africa in a lot of ways is we're not getting the real basics right. We're forgetting about the things that we can do on a daily basis in our families, in our communities. And I say that knowing full well how difficult that is, and how a single act, it's difficult to see the link of a single act to changing society. But I was trying to make this case, and I didn't put it in the piece, but I do some work in rural Eastern Cape. We have some research work happening there. And I can remember a number of years ago doing some training. And the place we were doing the training was on this hill. And we could look down the valley to the school, across the valley from where we were doing the training. And I watched early one morning just before the training started, and there was this long line of young kids. They were grade 1, grade 2, so 7, 8-year-olds. And they were all carrying their chairs on their head to school. And I was struck by that. I was struck by how it was a lovely picture in a way on an early morning in a rural area, and I was struck by their commitment. And then, I saw them get to school, and I thought, it would be lovely if that school, they didn't have to take their own chairs, but I didn't dwell too much on that. And then I did the training, we broke for tea, and I watched a whole lot of them now walk back. And I said to the person there, what's happening now? And they had their chairs with them. And she said, oh no, it's a Monday, and on most Mondays, their teacher doesn't arrive, so they waited there, and now they're coming home. Now, for me, that's getting the basics wrong. Those kids were doing their part. They were at the school. When our response, and this I see whenever I drive around, our individual responses to when we drive, to aggressive drivers, we drive aggressively. We have this aggressive kind of response to things, and all these, and I could name a whole lot more, but all these little acts contribute to a sense of anger, of aggression, and our not getting the basics right at the beginning ultimately does actually, in a very long line, lead to much of the horror that we see, because we're not caring for our children, we're not protecting our children, whether that's because in the Western Cape, one of the highest, the biggest reasons for the death of young children is in road accidents, pedestrian accidents. We're not protecting our children, and we've got to get that right. And to some extent, we obviously have to fix this bigger picture, the bigger problem. But that's also the role of government, of our Department of Social Development and Health, and everybody to also make their contribution at the macro level. Yeah.
Now, you speak about getting the basics right. Just a few weeks ago, we heard the very latest and rather shocking statistics pertaining to our children in early childhood development. And if you do speak to the experts, it makes a lot of sense for resources to be plowed into that age group because of the impact that it has on people as they grow and get older. And then if they have had the resources, if they have been fed and been nourished correctly at that early age, they become less of a burden on society, on government, etc., etc., etc. It all makes sense. Why does the sense and the logic not hit through? Because if the basic is just feeding children correctly, especially the first 3 years of their life. Like you say in your piece, you close very powerfully, if we cannot prevent babies starving to death, then perhaps we do not deserve to survive as a country. Is it, as you say, sometimes it's just too much, we want to put our heads in the sand, or it's easier just to laugh at the government, the president, the cabinet minister, at their funny little flagpole they wanted to put up for 22 million rand?
So look, I mean, as you know, I've read the piece. I did mention that, and I did that with some trepidation because I think everyone's sick and tired of that flagpole now. But the timing of that discussion for me was so emblematic of something we're getting wrong as well. Is that in the context of those babies and children having starved to death in Nelson Mandela Bay, to then be talking about spending that amount of money on a flagpole, it was the contrast. It was it's just such a distinct juncture to what we should be doing. It's and I said in another interview the other day, I said, there's something about the way in which I think that there's this, the government's got lost in some way in terms of the way they think about this. Is surely someone in marketing could have turned that whole thing around, and actually they had some discussion. Someone comes around and said, Nati, kind of like in the context of where we are right now with those, let's not do that flag. But why don't you say we were going to do it and we're not going to do it now because we're going to put that money into a feeding scheme? It could have been turned around very easily into a public relations win, not to mention the benefits for the children and the babies. And instead it just became this circus, I think, to some extent. And that for me also says we're getting something terribly, terribly wrong. We are not a rich country like the US, but on this continent, one of the richer countries. We're an upper middle income country. Babies should not be starving to death. We've got enough food, we've got enough resources. It's not acceptable.
And I think more and more we're seeing civil society, the people that are standing up. Just today, I think I saw a radio station in Cape Town raised 8 million rand to go into a local school feeding scheme. And if our office bearers aren't going to feed our kids, perhaps it's up to us to do it, because we're going to wait until who knows when for that to happen. Mark, always a pleasure to speak to you. Professor Mark Tomlinson is the director of the Institute for Life Course Research. He's with Stellenbosch University. Go and have a look at that piece he's written on News 24 entitled "The Subtle Failure in Our Approach to Child Protection." Now, keep your children behind closed doors at all times and out of harm's way. That's the message from Cape Flats residents who say they've had enough of children falling victim to crime.